Chapter 2. As she hurried along the winding dirt trail back to the cottage, Rory's mind was filled with thoughts of Gabe. She shivered, but this time it wasn't from the cold. This time she trembled at the memory of being held in Gabe Stevenson's arms. When he'd pulled her up out of the water and held her in his strong arms, she'd all but melted. Her heartbeat accelerated, and warm tingles ran the length of her body at his touch. Peering into his vivid blue eyes, she'd glimpsed his surprise and something more. Appreciation? His gaze lowered to her lips before he suddenly stopped himself and stepped away. For years she had dreamed of Gabe's kisses, but they had never crossed that line. Rory knew he looked on her more as a little sister than as a woman he could date. Maybe it was better that way. She didn't need the added worry of something happening to another person she loved. Memories clouded her thoughts of the fire that had killed her parents. She ran a shaky hand through her wet hair. Recently, her aunts had been targeted by someone threatening to harm them. Rory feared that somehow it was all her fault that people she loved were hurt, or worse. Hurrying up the steps to the back door of their cottage, she ran into the kitchen. "Rory, there you are. We were all set to come looking for you." Her aunt's slender form bustled back and forth between the stove and the mixer. She was a whirlwind who loved to be either in the kitchen cooking or outside gardening. "Aunt Florrie, I was just getting more seaweed. It's a sunny day for it." Rory kissed her on the cheek and breathed deeply of the chicken and vegetable soup. "Dinner sure smells good." "It'll soon be finished, dearie. I'll turn the pot down to simmer so we can get the seaweed on the drying pans in the backyard." "Thanks, Aunt Florrie. I'll go find Aunt Mary and see if she has time to help." Rory grabbed one of the sliced carrots and popped it into her mouth. She had just turned around to head up the stairs when her other aunt walked into the room leaning heavily on her cane. Aunt Fawn was the oldest of the three aunts. Just last week they had celebrated Aunt Fawn's 60th birthday. This past year, she'd suffered more health problems with her rheumatism flaring up at different times. Rory didn't like to ask her for help for fear it would make things worse. Yet, because of Aunt Fawn's ailments, she was constantly worried about everybody else's health. "Oh, my dear, you're all wet. You should go change your clothes. You don't want to catch your death." Rory leaned close and kissed Aunt Fawn's soft cheek. "I'll do that, Auntie. Be back soon." She hurried up the stairs to her bedroom and slipped out of her wet clothes and into her practical work shirt and jeans. Thoughts of Gabe continued to drift through her mind. No big surprise there. After all these years, her childhood friend never left her thoughts for long. Walking over to her writing desk, she glanced at the index cards and notebooks filled with story ideas. With gentle fingers, she traced the row of romance books on her bookshelf that she'd written since she was 14. More evidence of Gabe's influence on her life. Her attraction to him had given her a way to express her longing for love through writing, even though she couldn't have the man himself. Rory sighed. Now Gabe was back on the island to stay for a few weeks. How would she be able to be near her childhood friend without revealing her attraction to him? "You'll simply need to guard your heart and not let Gabe get too close. You can do this." The voice in her head sounded very confident. Hopefully, she would stick to her resolve and keep her distance from him. Yet how could she keep her distance and at the same time ask for his help? She really needed his help to figure out who was behind all the strange incidents that had been happening on the island. Biting her lip, she thought of her three aunts. She would do everything she could to protect them, but they refused to leave Walker's Island because they loved it here. This was their home, and they couldn't imagine living anywhere else. After all, they had moved here because of her. They had been trying to protect their sister's only daughter. This beautiful island had been the one home that was vivid in Rory's memory. Only vague memories flitted through her mind of the house she grew up in with her parents. They'd moved here right after her 6th birthday, the same party that ended with a house fire and her parents' tragic death. She shuddered and fingered the heart-shaped locket her mom had given her on her 6th birthday. Waves of sadness rolled over her. Rory shook her head in a desperate attempt to dispel the horrible memories. She couldn't think of that right now. It had been right after she lost her parents that her 3 aunts had finally accepted Walker Stevenson's offer to live in this cottage on the island. Her 3 aunts had saved Walker's life years ago, and he told her aunts he wanted to do something for them. Gabe's great-grandfather had assured them they could live rent-free for the rest of their lives in the cottage on Walker's Island. When Rory was 6 years old, they moved to this beautiful place. Through the years, Rory grew to love it here, even though at times it was a little lonely. Twice a month they took the boat to the small town of Paradise Lake. That's how she had a chance to make a few friends her age, like Bella and Roselle. They had become such good friends. Rory had spent time with them, and they had helped each other over the years. Bella had helped her find a publisher for her first romance novel years ago, and Roz had helped her research plants that would help create wonderful skincare creams to help with her aunt's skin problems. As it turned out, both the novels and developing the skincare creams had been just what Rory needed to do. She never imagined her novels would become popular. The money she earned from novels had helped her aunts to fix the house. Rory had also been able to get the equipment she needed to continue to develop the skincare products. It was a start. Rory said a prayer of thanks that she'd finally had a breakthrough as she experimented with mixtures of seaweed, botanicals, marine algae, and essential oils. Her aunt's skincare troubles were getting better. Glancing over at the boxes of bottles and labels that were stacked near her desk, she shook herself out of her daydream. The work wasn't going to get done by itself. Quickly, she opened her bedroom door and hurried down the hallway toward her aunt's room. "Aunt Mary, can I come in?" After several knocks, she slowly opened the door, knowing that sometimes her aunt got caught up in her work. At the sound of the squeaky door, her aunt turned quickly, placing her hand on her chest. "Oh my, Rory, you startled me." "Sorry, Auntie. You busy?" "I promised your Aunt Florrie I would type up her recipes and make a book out of them, but I'm struggling to read some of her writing." Aunt Mary lifted a sheet of paper with scrawled writing towards the window. Pushing her glasses up her nose, she squinted, trying to see the words better. Rory leaned closer to try to help her. "You're right. It is hard to read. Maybe we should ask Aunt Florrie." "I think you're right, dearie. Florrie is a good cook, but not so good at writing. I guess that's why we sisters need each other, right?" Rory hugged her aunt and opened the door. "Right. Hey, while you have a moment, could you help us organize and clean the large piles of seaweed?" Aunt Mary followed Rory down the stairs and spoke with a mischievous smile hovering over her lips. "Oh, now I understand, Rory. This was just a ploy to get me downstairs so you could put me to work." "Not very subtle, I suppose," Rory grinned. "No, but I'm always happy to help you, Rory." Aunt Mary squeezed her in a tight hug. Rory hugged her back and they hurried out the back door. Together, they had made the backyard larger, adding a tall wooden fence around the perimeter to keep out the wild animals. When Rory started high school, Aunt Mary had been her teacher. It was during those years when she had researched and learned about the benefits of plants. "Aunt Florrie, you were supposed to wait for us." Rory called to her aunt, who was busy setting the drying pans out, on which they would place the wet seaweed to dry. "Well, I didn't know when you'd be coming, so I thought I might as well get started." Rory shook her head and hurried over to the garden shed to grab more drying pans. Aunt Florrie had always been a hard worker and usually got started quickly on most things. She kept them all organized so they got the work done. Aunt Mary followed, and it didn't take long before they had 10 long horizontal rows lined up. Working together, they pulled out buckets of seaweed out of the garden shed. They began to sort through the soggy long green plants, laying them out on the drying pans. She found a few tiny critters hiding in the long-stemmed plants, and used the garden hose to spray the plants clean. "Rory, this is one of the largest piles of these slimy green plants you've harvested yet. You should be able to make a bunch of those skincare creams from this stack." Aunt Florrie wrinkled her nose and sprayed the large plants she held tightly in her hands. Rory, what your aunt means to say is that we are very grateful for all your hard work researching and learning everything you have about these plants. You've managed to create skin creams that have helped each of us. Warmth flooded Rory as her gaze landed on Aunt Mary's bright smile. Her aunt's cheeks were now free of the rosacea that used to cover her nose and cheeks. Her heart warmed knowing that all three aunts had been helped by her plant mixtures. Rory wanted to do everything she could to help the three women who had raised her like surrogate mums after her parents died. You're welcome, Auntie. I'm just happy we were able to learn about the helpful health benefits of all the green stuff in the sea. Rory giggled as Aunt Florrie's hands got twisted up in the long green stems. There might be a lot of health benefits, but sometimes they are not so easy to handle. Aunt Florrie shook her head as she struggled to untangle her hands. Let me help, Auntie. Rory hurried to stand beside her aunt and helped unscramble her hands from the long strands of seaweed that clung together. When it was done, she sprayed the last pile clean and set it on the drying pans. All done. It should be dry by morning. They took off their gloves and aprons they used for the dirty work and hung them up in the small porch by the back kitchen door. Aunt Fawn had just finished setting the table when they walked in the door. Biscuits should be ready by the time you all wash up. Rory waited until Aunt Mary and Aunt Florrie were finished washing. By the time she sat at the kitchen table, her stomach had growled 3 times. Let's first give thanks. Aunt Fawn blessed the food and stood to ladle out the soup. Rory, dear, let me fill your bowl. Once everyone was served, the chatter began. Rory, tell us about your day. You must have found something interesting, because you got home later than usual. Aunt Mary buttered her biscuit, one eyebrow tilted up in interest. Her 3 aunts listened intently as Rory spoke. I found an old wooden oar not far from the pier today. It might have been from that boating accident that was in Paradise Lake's newspaper 10 years ago. Maybe. Wouldn't that be interesting? Aunt Florrie ladled more soup for herself and the others. I also found a few sea critters trying to hide under rocks. Last night's strong winds must have brought the tide up and washed them ashore. Rory grinned, always thrilled to see new things pop up on the beach. Were you able to take some pictures? Yes, I did. Here they are. Rory opened her smartphone, scrolled to the pictures, and passed her phone around the table. The smartphone she used was the same one her aunts gave her years ago. She took it with her everywhere to take pictures here on Walker's Island, because they didn't have access to the internet. I'll print off this new collection of photos next time we go to Paradise Lake. We should get you another scrapbook, Rory. You've already filled the last one. Aunt Fawn loved looking at pictures. Every once in a while I go through your photo albums and scrapbooks. I was just looking at the pictures you took when we went sailing that last time with Walker Stevenson and his great-grandson Gabe. I think you were 16, Rory. Too bad those days had to come to an end. Well, Aunt Fawn, as it turns out, those days might not be completely over. Whatever do you mean, Rory? Aunt Fawn's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Just that I saw Gabe Stevenson today. He's back on the island. All 3 aunts' eyes widened and their jaws dropped. Rory grinned. He wanted to see you all, so I told him to stop by for lunch tomorrow. Mommy, where are you? She woke up with a scream and sat up straight in bed, panic squeezing her throat. Smoke filled the room and she could hardly breathe. Scurrying off her bed, she ran from her room out into the hallway. Daddy! Her hands shook as she ran them along the wall that led to her parents' bedroom. Fits of coughing soon followed. Where was Mummy? Why wasn't Daddy answering her? How come she could hardly breathe? She called again, only no one answered. Sweat formed on her forehead as heat and flashes of fire spewed from the big crack in the door. She was about to touch the door when somebody grabbed her by the shoulders and carried her away. Rory! In her nightmare, she tried to shake the person off. She was desperate to save her parents from the fire. Rory, wake up! We need your help! Someone shook her shoulders once more, and Rory opened her eyes wide. Aunt Florrie stood over her like an avenging angel. Rory bolted upright in bed, somewhat taken aback by the shrill voice of her normally calm aunt. "What's happened? Are Aunt Mary and Aunt Fawn okay?" Rory scrambled to get off the bed. "Yes, your aunts are fine, Rory, but you'd better come outside." Without another word, Aunt Florrie hurried out of her bedroom and ran down the stairs. Rory frowned and, without bothering to change out of her pajamas, chased after her down the stairs. Flying out the door, she was greeted by a haze of smoke and fire. Aunt Fawn had the water hose turned on high as she sprayed the hothouse, while Aunt Mary threw water from overly full buckets onto the garden shed. Both small buildings had flames shooting out the sides. "What happened?" Rory asked Aunt Florrie as she grabbed another bucket and filled it with water. "We don't know. Both the seaweed and drying pans are ruined too." "Sorry, love." Her aunt hurried to throw more water on the roof of the garden shed. A truck door slammed, and Rory turned to see Gabe running towards her. "I saw the smoke from the fire. Are you all okay?" "Yes, Gabe, we're all okay. Just trying to put out the fire so it doesn't reach the house." Rory handed him a bucket, suddenly relieved to see Gabe. "Let's form a line to get the water on the buildings faster," Gabe suggested, and her aunts were eager to comply. After that, it didn't take long until they had doused out the fire. Wide-eyed, Rory stared at both buildings where smoke and steam bounced off the rooftops. That hothouse looked ready to collapse, and the drying pans were all wrecked, and the seaweed she'd harvested scattered and torn all over their backyard. Tears filled her eyes and rolled down her cheeks, clearing a path through the dirt and soot. She'd had so many plans to experiment with a new mixture of botanicals and plants, and now most of it was doomed to lie in the ashes. "Sweetie, we'll build again, and it'll be even better next time, you'll see." Aunt Mary pulled her close and wrapped her in a big hug. Rory savored the comfort. "I'll go make a pot of tea. It'll help settle our nerves as we figure out a way to solve this new problem." Aunt Florrie kissed her forehead and made her way into the house. Soon Aunt Mary and Aunt Fawn followed her. "I'm so sorry this happened, Rory." Gabe spoke softly as he came to stand beside her. Rory did her best to wipe the tears off her cheeks before she looked up at him. "Me too, Gabe. I don't know what happened. All the tools I used were back in place and everything was in order before I went inside last night." Rory shivered, and a furrow puckered her brows from anxiety. Huge knots of fear formed in her belly. "I can tell you just thought of something. What is it?" Gabe tucked a long strand of hair behind her ear, and Rory's heart fluttered at his touch. He used to slip her hair behind her ears when they went sailing, and would tell her he wanted to see her beautiful face. Today, more than ever, his gentle words and the warmth of his touch reached a place deep inside her heart. It scared her how vulnerable she was to him. Shifting from one foot to the other, she looked away and swallowed, tamping down her emotions. Rory couldn't let Gabe see how much his nearness affected her. She refocused and peered up at him, unsure of how much to tell him. "To tell you the truth, Gabe, there have been other strange things happening on the island for the past year or so." Gabe crossed his arms over his chest. What do you mean by strange things?" Rory shifted on her feet. "Just human footprints from our house through the trees to the beach that were not from us. And little things like the greenhouse herbs being ruined and someone smashing all my jars that I use for making my skincare creams." Gabe's lips formed a thin line, a tick appearing along his jawline. "Exactly when were you going to tell me?" "Honestly, Gabe, you don't need to get so upset. We thought it was a small thing, and besides, where would we have found you to tell you anything?" Rory's tone of voice was sharper than she intended. This show of emotion on her part surprised even her. Maybe it was time for her to admit that it really bothered her that he'd left suddenly almost 5 years ago. She knew he was busy with his speaking and training events, but she thought that they had become friends. True friends kept in touch. Why did Gabe expect to be informed of these strange incidents when he hadn't cared enough to talk to her in years? Gabe expelled a breath and ran a hand through his hair. You're right, Rory. I haven't done much to earn the right to know what's going on in your lives. I've done a terrible job at keeping in touch. Her eyes widened that he'd read her mind. For a moment it seemed like time stood still. They could still read each other's thoughts from all those summers spent together. I'm sorry, Rory. I'm going to do better. I'll do whatever it takes so you and your aunts are safe. Forgive me? Sure, Gabe. Of course I forgive you, Rory said quickly. She could admit she was still a little piqued at him, but her heart softened at his heartfelt apology. Turmoil stirred in her belly. She bit her lip to stop herself from crying as her gaze swept over the devastation and ashes in their backyard. Why did this happen to them? Gabe reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. She closed her eyes and sighed. Hopelessness washed over her. He rubbed the top of her hand with his thumb. We're going to find a way to protect all of you, I promise. Thanks, Gabe. I know you mean well, but how do we know when or how this person will strike again? From what I can see, the problem is that whoever is doing this seems to be targeting me specifically. Her forehead puckered with worry before she looked up at him. For some reason, they want to ruin anything that is near or dear to me. I'm so scared this person will hurt my 3 aunts. Gabe put one arm around her shoulders for a moment and whispered, Not on my watch. Rory shivered with warmth at his unexpected embrace. His arm trembled slightly and he kissed the top of her head. She was surprised at the swiftness and intensity of his protectiveness. Without warning, memories flitted across her mind of that country song Gabe sang each time he took her out on his sailboat. Cowboy Take Me Away by the country band Dixie Chicks. He'd caught her singing and dancing to that song one summer when she was 13 and had teased her with it ever since. Her heart turned to mush whenever she remembered those few weeks every summer she spent with him. Being so close to Gabe Stevenson, the man she'd dreamed about for years, made her long for more. She just wanted to be close to him every day. Rory shut out that thought as quickly as it came. She couldn't afford to let herself be drawn in by this man. Gabe was someone who was famous and in demand. He would forever be out of her reach. She needed to guard her heart. Don't let yourself fall for him, Rory. He will always be a man who spends time with you and just as suddenly leaves you again. With that sober reminder, Rory stepped out of his reach, nervously running a hand through her messy hair. I think this is a problem that won't be fixed in one day. Let's go inside and have some of Aunt Florrie's tea. Gabe nodded, his face pensive. That sounds good, and I'm going to have a talk with your aunts. We've got to figure out a way to solve this. Rory nodded as she turned and opened the kitchen door. She saw all 3 aunts sitting and talking around the table. We thought we'd join you 3 for tea. Rory pulled a chair out for Gabe. But first, I'm going to wash off this soot and dirt. Be back soon. Rory hurried up the stairs to her room and took a quick shower, changing into clean jeans and a t-shirt. Brushing out her hair, she quickly put it up in a ponytail. As she hurried back down the stairs, she heard Aunt Mary speaking in hushed whispers, but Rory couldn't hear what they were saying. Gabe pulled out a letter from his pocket as soon as she sat at the table. This is the letter Gran told me to give you all. Sorry it took me so long to bring it to you. Aunt Mary read the letter from Walker Stevenson out loud. To my 3 good fairies, if you're reading this, I've gone on to my reward. I want to tell you one last time how much I appreciate the 3 of you gals for how you saved my neck all those years ago. You did me a good turn, and now I want to repay the favor. All 3 of you, and your beautiful niece Rory, need better access in case things take a turn for the worse on that island. So I thought I'd pull one last trick I have hidden up my sleeve. Surprised you, didn't I? I've given instructions to my old lawyer and his son that as soon as you give him this letter, they will set up satellite to the island so that you have internet access. I should have done it years ago, but never got around to it. But now it'll get done. My great-grandson Gabe will help out with anything else you need. Tell him Gran said so. My hope is that these new services will help you all feel safer, more connected to others, and more at peace on the island. I hope you enjoy that little slice of heaven on earth as much as I have. Signed, Walker Stevenson. Rory looked around the table and saw all three of her aunts dabbing at their eyes. It's just like your great-grandfather to do something crazy and wonderful like this as a last surprise, Gabe. Aunt Mary's eyelashes glistened with tears as she looked over at Gabe. Yeah, he always did like surprising people by having the last word. Gabe chuckled softly. Rory could tell he was moved by his great-grandfather's kind gesture, too. Well, I'm glad Gran did this. I'll need to go to Seattle to get that satellite set up, as well as take care of a few things. I hope to be back on the island by the end of the week. Gabe nodded to everyone, said his goodbyes, and walked towards the door. Rory followed him outside. It was thoughtful of your great-grandfather to do that for us. We'll all feel safer for it. Rory stood with her hands tucked in her pockets, looking down at her feet before meeting Gabe's eyes. He grinned, and a crinkle formed along the edge of his mesmerizing blue eyes. Gran always loved his surprises. It's just like him to have one last hurrah. Memories of summers spent laughing at Walker Stevenson's teasing rose to the surface. Rory treasured those days. Gabe reached over and tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. Rory shivered at his touch. Gran really cared about his 4 island ladies. I want you to have fun and feel safe here. Rory swallowed back tears. There hadn't been many people in their lives who had cared what happened to the 4 of them. It had been the 4 of them doing so much of life alone, ever since she was a little girl. A painful longing squeezed her belly at Gabe's touch. Rory forced it down and blinked rapidly, trying desperately to hold back tears that threatened to spill over. Well, I should get going, Rory. Gabe squeezed her hand. I'll be back Friday. We'll go sailing then. She forced a smile and waved as he got in Gran's old truck and drove away. As the truck disappeared behind the trees, a familiar pain pierced her heart. Gabe had left, again. She was grateful he was making their island a safer place, but in some ways she wished he would disappear out of their lives again. It was too painful to have Gabe close by, only to have him leave again. It was too difficult to be reminded of her attraction to him every day. Besides, what if they really weren't safe here? Her aunts had told her on her 18th birthday that someone they knew from a long time ago had threatened to harm her when she turned 21. So every year when the calendar moved closer to her birthday, her aunts insisted she stay close to home. Rory trembled at the reminder. Her birthday was very soon. She would need to make sure Gabe was far away from her on that day. Rory was terrified somehow he would be harmed. She would do everything possible so that no one else she loved was hurt. Pushing her shoulders back, she walked into the cottage with a new resolve. A small voice inside whispered a warning. No matter which way I look at it, I'd best not let myself get too attached to Gabe Stevenson. If I do, it'll mean trouble for both of us.